So I am delighted to introduce Dr. Francesca Stella and Professor Rebecca Kay from the University of Glasgow as our keynote speakers today. Francesca and Rebecca have collaborated on the research project, Language Learning and Migrant Integration in Scotland, exploring infrastructure, provisions and experiences, and are here today to present some of their preliminary findings of their research. Research that I believe is very timely as we continue to navigate a changing policy landscape in Scotland presently within Esol. Without further ado, I hand you over to Francesca and Becca. Thank you so much for joining us today, ladies.
Thank you very much for having us, Pauline, and it's nice to see everyone. I'm just about to share my screen, so please bear with me. So thanks very much for the opportunity to share our preliminary findings with you today. And we hope that we didn't cram in too much into the presentation, and that there will be a little bit of time at the end for feedback and for, questions and so on. So this talk, as Paulina mentioned, is based on the preliminary findings of a research project called Language Learning and Migrant Integration in Scotland, exploring infrastructure and provision and experiences, which was originally due to run from 2019 to 2021, but because of COVID, we had an extension. We had to pause in between when we had an extension of a year, so we will finish next year. So in this qualitative study, we explored the complex landscape of Esol provision in Scotland through a comparison between Glasgow and Aberdeenshire, and we considered the perspective of diverse Esol providers, decision makers, practitioners, and learners. So the fieldwork was mainly conducted between February and August 2021, and it took place at a point when Esol in Scotland was undergoing profound changes in terms of policy and governance, as well as a consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we interview experts, teachers, and community-based practitioners, as well as learners. But in our presentation today, we would like to focus on the challenges faced by the sector at a time of significant change. And we are focusing in particular on the so-called expert interviews, interviews with policymakers and those with responsibility or oversight of Esol, among the biggest Esol providers in Scotland and Aberdeenshire. So I would like to add that we will produce a full report of our findings in the coming months, and we are planning to hold a workshop in March to share it. And we would like to bring together Esol practitioners based in different parts of Scotland and the UK, and to engage them in discussions on the implications on the findings for policy and practice around Esol provision and delivery. There's a lot of research that is coming out at UK level at the moment, so we'll engage with that as well. And we would be delighted if you could come to the workshop, and we will keep you posted about it through NATECLA. So I'll just hand over to Becca for the next couple of slides.
Okay, hopefully everyone can hear me now. It's a bit hard to work out from my side whether that's working okay. I'm assuming, since Francesca's not waving frantically, that you can. So thanks for that, Francesca. And I just will talk a little bit to begin with about why we wanted to look at language learning and integration together. And our backgrounds prior to starting this project, we've both been involved in research on migration to Scotland from Central Eastern Europe over the last 10 years or so. And through that work, we've both become increasingly interested in Esol and language learning as a theme because of the major role it plays in migrant experiences and processes of settlement, especially, although not only, for those arriving with limited or no English. But it's not just about migrant experiences. At the level of political discourse and policy, language training is often presented as a central component of national integration policies, not just in the UK, but elsewhere as well. Such integration policies are often formulated in very vague terms, and in the UK and Scotland, they're focused on refugees and asylum seekers, who are also subject to a huge amount of scrutiny and control from the UK government during the process of settlement, with no specific integration programs for migrants arriving through other routes, such as work or family visas, or until recently as EU citizens with free movement rights. At the UK level, there's been a lot of continuity over the past 20 years in political rhetoric from both New Labour and Tory governments, presenting language as the key to successful integration for new migrants. And you can see two quotes on the screen there from David Blunkett and Theresa May. And although arguably there's a shift in emphasis from Blunkett noting the responsibility of governments to tackle segregation and connect people, under Theresa May, that became much more a blame the migrant stance. But still, in both cases, language is seen as key. And yet this rhetoric hasn't been matched by resources for language training and the ESOL sector. Under New Labour and up until the financial crisis of 2008, there was funding made available for ESOL. And in England, this happened through Skills for Life, a national strategy for improving adult literacy, ESOL and numeracy skills. But in other devolved nations, there was also a trend to support and institutionalise ESOL provision within FE colleges. This increased attention and resources devoted to ESOL resulted in the creation of a national curriculum for ESOL and professionalisation of the ESOL workforce. However, under the LibCon coalition and successive Conservative governments, funding for ESOL has been dramatically cut. And these cuts need to be understood in the context of austerity measures and cuts to education and local authority budgets more broadly. But they also relate to other policies designed to cut net migration to the UK and to deter migrants from coming to or remaining in the UK through the hostile environment. Under successive Conservative governments, very few resources have been allocated to integration policies or ESOL, effectively placing the responsibility for integrating and learning English solely on migrants. For example, a whole chapter of the 2018 Integrated Communities Green Paper is devoted to English language training, and the Green Paper promised an ESOL strategy for England, the only UK nation lacking one at the time, yet 3 years later, England still doesn't have an ESOL strategy. The paradox for us then is that there's been this continuous emphasis on language as a central plank of integration and social cohesion policies for almost 2 decades. However, this isn't matched by adequate investment or a long-term vision for the ESOL sector. And there's also a lack of joined-up thinking about how language learning relates to migrant lives and needs in the context of settlement. From a Scottish perspective, the political framing of ESOL and language learning is made more complicated by the nature of and relationship between reserved and devolved areas of policy making. ESOL falls under the education remit, which is a devolved matter, but the ESOL landscape is also shaped in fundamental ways by migration policies, which are reserved to Westminster. The impacts and implications of this for ESOL in Scotland is something that we'll come back to through the presentation, both in more detail as a background and when we get on to talking about the actual landscapes of ESOL in the 2 places where we did our research. So moving on to the next slide. In our presentation today, we're focused on the challenges faced by the ESOL sector at a time of significant change and upheaval. In particular, we'll look at 3 dimensions to these challenges: migration policy and its impact on ESOL learners, reform of ESOL governance in Scotland, and how could we not speak about COVID and the aftermath of the pandemic. When we started the project, we were particularly interested in how the overlapping, but also in some respects divergent migration policy landscapes of Scotland and the wider UK impacted on opportunities for ESOL learning and understandings of its relationship to integration in Scotland. In Scotland and elsewhere in the UK, ESOL provision on the ground has developed organically in response to the arrival of different groups of new migrants and their diverse learning needs. Whilst migration is a reserved matter, so who is able to come and settle in the UK and Scotland is decided on in Westminster, several policy areas that relate to migrant integration, such as education, are devolved, creating the potential for doing things somewhat differently in Scotland. And we wanted to explore what that actually meant in practice. We were also interested in the ways in which ESOL governance itself was changing within Scotland. Since 2007, ESOL provision in Scotland has been overseen by 2 successive Scottish Government ESOL strategies, published in 2007 and 2015 respectively, providing a framework against which ESOL delivery can, to an extent, be resourced and monitored. However, these strategies have not been immune to change and shifting governmental and funding priorities. In 2018, the infrastructure set out in the 2015 Esol strategy was subject to changes which altered the funding pathways of SFC resources and increased emphasis on accredited Esol provision. We'll explore in more details the impacts of this for Esol provision and practice in Glasgow and Aberdeenshire later in the talk. Moreover, the second Scotland Esol strategy was due for renewal in 2020, but in 2019, the Scottish Government decided to move the Esol remit from education to the CLD unit and to merge different aspects of adult education, including Esol, into a broader adult learning strategy, rather than renew a standalone Esol strategy. A draft of the adult learning strategy was circulated for consultation in June 2021, but has yet to be finalised. Obviously, in the interim, we have COVID and its longer term implications and repercussions. Not surprisingly, given that we were conducting fieldwork over the last year, this became a key theme which emerged through our study, albeit one we couldn't have planned for in advance. Towards the end of our talk, we'll discuss the impacts of a rapid switch to online provision, creative solutions, and indeed some unexpected positives, as well as ongoing challenges which our participants told us about. But for now, I'll hand back to Francesca, who's going to talk a little bit more about the policy context and Esol governance in Scotland.
Thank you, Becca. So as Becca mentioned, Esol is formally part of the education remit and therefore a devolved matter, but in reality cuts across and is shaped by migration, integration and education policies. So I would like to briefly outline the UK and Scotland policy landscape around migration, which has changed dramatically over the last few years. And this brings changes in who is allowed to move to and settle in the UK. And this also means potential changes in demand for Esol. So first of all, the end of free movement resulting from Brexit is likely to have a significant impact on the Esol sector. The substantial influx of migrant workers from the EU and particularly Central and Eastern Europe was one of the drivers behind the expansion of the Esol sector in the early 2000s. But since Brexit, next migration from the EU has fallen considerably. Secondly, the introduction of a new skill-based migration system that prioritizes migrant in skilled occupations is also a significant development. Demonstrating fluency in English has become a requirement for being issued a so-called skilled worker visa. And this may mean fewer migrants needing Esol or needing different levels of Esol. And thirdly, the proposed changes to the asylum seeker currently under examination in the UK Parliament may prioritise the direct transfer of refugees to the UK over asylum seekers arriving to the UK independently. A recent report on migration and language learning after Brexit, commissioned by the Learning and Work Institute, predicts that demand for Esol in the UK will continue, but the balance between basic and higher levels needs may change. And it also goes on to say that the Esol sector, therefore, needs to be ready to adapt to these changes in demand and need. Border control and migration policy are a reserved matter, but the Scottish Government and also Scottish local authorities have consistently expressed a different stance, particularly in relationship on the relationship between migration and settlement. For example, they have emphasised the economic benefits of migration for Scotland and encouraged migration to rural area facing depopulation. And they have also expressed a desire to take the maximum possible number of people through refugee settlement schemes. So this could, in theory, influence a different prioritising of Esol. And this arguably has been the case in the past. So, for example, unlike England, which has lacked an Esol strategy since 2007, Scotland has developed and implemented two successive Esol strategies. Moreover, Esol provision for asylum seekers is specifically linked in Scotland to the aim of integration from day one. And this again is very different from what's happening in England. On the other hand, in recent years, austerity cuts to education, especially further education and local authority budgets, have had an impact on the Esol sector. And arguably, this has resulted in provision being driven by policy priority and available funding rather than need, and in a lack of long-term vision. So several aspects of Esol governance in Scotland have changed or are in flux at the moment, which Becca has already mentioned. So first of all, the model for distributing funds provided by the Scottish Founding Council changed in 2018. So prior to 2018, Esol delivery in local areas was coordinated through community planning partnerships. And in this model, different types of Esol providers received resourcing from the SFC, and the partnership then decided how to spend funds and distributed funds among the partners. This was not the only source of Esol funding. There was also funding available, for example, through local authorities funds, but it was the biggest one. So in 2018, new guidance was published to formalize Esol governance, and there were two key changes. So first of all, rather than going straight to the community planning partnerships, Esol funds were channeled directly to colleges, which had the responsibility for allocating funds to community partners. And secondly, the allocation of funds was tied more closely to learners' attendance, progression, and outcomes in an attempt to make the system more accountable. So this funding model arguably had the biggest impact on providers delivering non-accredited classes in the community, although guidance was interpreted differently in different local authorities, as we shall see. We also understand that SFC funds are no longer ring-fenced for Esol, and that colleges can spend them in different ways, but we're not quite sure about this point, and we would welcome your feedback on this point. The second major change affecting the Esol sector is that in 2019, the Esol remit was moved unexpectedly from Education Scotland to the CLD unit within the Scottish Government. And the third major change was that the Esol strategy, due for renewal in 2020, was paused, and it was decided to create a broader adult learning strategy, which would encompass literacy and numeracy as well as Esol. Work on the strategy was delayed by the pandemic, but a draft strategy was circulated for consultation in June 2021. And there are two interesting aspects to this. So the strategy focuses on community-based adult learning, and the rationale for this is that less is known about community settings than about formal education settings. However, the report barely mentions the further education sector, and this strikes us as a bit odd, since this is meant to be an adult learning strategy for Scotland, which encompasses, as we understand it, both community and more formal education settings. Secondly, the draft strategy includes recommendations to undertake a review on the impact of both the Esol and adult literacy strategies, and to produce further recommendation on the next steps for these specialisms. But as yet, there is no firm commitment, as we understand, to create distinct Esol and adult learning strategies under the broader adult learning strategy. So the focus on community provision and the potential to develop perhaps more joined up work across different Esol providers and across formal and more informal provision was welcomed by some of the people that we interviewed. But in the main, the non-renewal of the Esol strategy caused concern, particularly around the potential deprioritization of Esol, and concern that this would translate into loss of resources for the sector, the disappearance of Esol as a distinctive field of learning in the broader strategy, lack of awareness of the distinctive and very diverse profile of Esol learners, the deprofessionalization or lack of appreciation of Esol practitioners' expertise. And importantly, concerns were also raised about the fact that not having a standalone Esol strategy is likely to make coordination of provision across different providers more difficult. Something that seems to be emerging quite strongly from our study so far is diversity as a central feature of Esol at a range of levels. But this is often overlooked in policy frameworks and funding models. So first of all, the Esol sector caters for a very distinctive and diverse group of learners in terms of their migrant status, socioeconomic background, educational literary levels, as well as gender, race, ethnicity, and so on. So for example, Esol learners range from highly qualified to people who need to learn and people who perhaps just need to improve their English, to those with little schooling in their own countries or literacy challenges. This was one of the main objections raised about the potential of merging ESOL and literacies in a broader adult education strategy. Secondly, the ESOL sector encompasses a huge range of providers, including further education colleges, local authority providers, and the voluntary sector. And in addition to these diverse ESOL providers, there is other provision not specifically branded as ESOL or focused on formal English language learning, but often tied in with broader support for migrant integration. For example, language cafes organized in Aberdeenshire by Greg and Samis, or integration networks in Glasgow, like the Govan Community Project. These services tend to have a more holistic oversight of learning, of how learning or practicing English fits into the broader process of settlement for migrants, and to have perhaps a better feel for people's motivations for learning English, the barriers that they may face, and so on. Thirdly, ESOL provision also looks very different in different regions of Scotland and across rural and urban locations. This reflects the different profile of learners and levels of demand, but also different levels of supply and challenges around meeting demand. And Becca will now explore this in more detail with regards to Aberdeenshire.
Thanks, Francesca. So as Francesca said, we're now going to move on and explore in a bit more detail what this landscape looks like and how it impacts on provisions and on experiences of teaching and learning on the ground. I'll start off by talking about Aberdeenshire and then hand over to Francesca to come back to Glasgow, which are the two places where we did our fieldwork. So to begin with, let's take a look at the profile of ESOL learners in Aberdeenshire. And this is a picture that's changed quite dramatically over the past 20 years, and one which has also required ESOL to evolve to meet the different needs of new groups of learners. A more relaxed approach based around evening classes for relatively secure Northern European migrants and/or the spouses and family of those on skilled worker or student visas was challenged in the early 2000s by the arrival of large numbers of mainly East European migrants to work in agriculture, fish and food processing, mainly in the north of Aberdeenshire. This was most noticeable in and around the towns of Peterhead and Fraserburgh, although also in smaller, more rural settings like Tarif and Banff or Mintlaw. Often in precarious and low-paid employment, struggling to access suitable housing, needing support to access benefits, enroll children in schools, or deal with health care and other services, these new learners had different needs. And in the words of one of our participants, ESOL provision became more about survival, employment, viability, integration. ESOL, she said, began to be seen as more than just language learning per se, and rather as the key that opens up everything else. Over time, as people have become more settled, migrant-based networks of support have developed, and post-Brexit, there's been some decline in numbers. And so these needs are perhaps less urgent and pronounced, but they're still quite present. Also, those who've been stuck in low-paid employment for several years now are increasingly seeking ESOL for progression, especially if they are committed to longer-term stays. However, the picture has been further complicated by the more recent arrival of Syrian New Scots as part of the UK government resettlement programme. These families have come to different areas of the region, mainly to more affluent rural villages and towns in central Aberdeenshire, away from the more deprived areas of the North Shire, where East European and other migrant workers continue to predominate as ESOL learners. Their numbers are in fact relatively small, but obviously this is a high-profile programme and one funded directly by the Home Office rather than the Scottish Funding Council or local authorities. The programme brings both specific and targeted funding for integration, including language learning, and formalised requirements about weekly provision, attendance at classes, and so on. At local authority level, the decision was taken to incorporate this group of learners into mainstream ESOL provision, rather than developing a different dedicated programme. Teachers and practitioners told us that some of the approaches developed over the past 10 to 15 years with East European learners have been useful and have been transferred over, but there's also been a need to adapt again to a new set of needs, And this has perhaps inevitably brought with it some competition for resource, both financial, but even more so in terms of energy and staffing. Pretty much simultaneously, there have been big changes in the way in which provision is funded and coordinated, as Francesca has already outlined. Over the last 10 to 15 years, a quite rich and diverse landscape of provision had developed, with a mixture of formal classes and more community-based activities offered by providers ranging from colleges to third sector organisations and migrant-led initiatives across Aberdeenshire. Councils provided classes themselves, but also signed service level agreements with providers like the WEA, who then had quite a lot of autonomy to offer a variety of activities, classes and initiatives. Learners with more advanced levels of English could access formal accredited classes through the college and latterly through community learning and development classes. But there was also a wide range of more social practice-based learning, where Esol was incorporated into initiatives, for example, to support pregnant women with access to maternity care, to provide one-stop shops for benefit advice and advocacy, or to increase social connections through language cafes. The introduction of the new funding model since 2018 has led to a reconfiguration of this mixed landscape into a partnership with quite a formalised division of labour between the WEA, providing for beginners and those with basic literacy needs, community learning and development covering intermediate levels, NAT 2 and 3, and then more advanced learners progressing to NATECLA, the local further education college, which provides both part-time and full-time courses at campuses in Aberdeen and Fraserburgh. With funding channeled through the college and distributed on the basis of learners accumulating credits, this has led to a more rigid model of provision and an emphasis on accredited learning and assessment. Third sector organisations and a range of ad hoc initiatives continue to offer other more community-based opportunities, for example, the language cafes or one-to-one buddying schemes. However, these are often funded through a range of non-Esol sources and mainly provide short-term projects, although some are quite established and ongoing. So bearing all this in mind, the key challenges in a place like Aberdeenshire seem to be around how to continue to provide an Esol offering that works for and can adapt to a changing and diverse set of learners and a variety of local needs and contexts. Many of the people we spoke to were clear that there was a need for strategic leadership, and whilst they didn't necessarily reference the Esol strategy as such, they did want a framework that would facilitate more joined up provision and better opportunities for sharing learning, ideas about good practice and ways of overcoming challenges, both within the region and with other parts of Scotland. And Glasgow and the Central Belt in particular were often seen as leading the way here. However, there was also a lot of concern that an overly rigid one-size-fits-all model wasn't and could not be sufficiently flexible or creative to meet the area's needs. The more formalised approaches that are coming through most strongly at the moment, without a doubt, suit some learners really well. But as one of our participants said, the college model works for some people, but I suppose what we're trying to achieve is the flexibility that you find a range of things that will work for a range of people at different stages. So the emphasis on progression and accreditation is welcomed by those, especially more advanced learners, with sufficient time and resource to prioritise language learning for a concentrated period of time and keen to improve their employment and career prospects in this way. The NESCOL model of learning focuses very much on individual learning plans, careers advice, and streaming advanced learners into courses with vocational slant on an Esol Plus model. So this fits well with the aspirations of those more advanced learners I've just mentioned. CLD has also put all its tutors through CELTA qualifications and gained SQA accreditation for all of its classes. And this means that those learners who want to do assessments and gain recognised qualifications through evening classes can also do so. But this emphasis on formal learning can also squeeze out other kinds of provision as not really Esol, and means there's less opportunity for shared learning and good practice between providers, or for learners to navigate non-traditional pathways through their learning journey. We came across all sorts of examples of creative approaches and initiatives, classes in workplaces and with buy-in from local employers, classes in primary schools and nursery settings with a focus on building social networks, facilitating family learning and supporting parents, a variety of language cafes and buddy schemes to help support social connections or focus on particular language needs. but often providers working in quite close geographical proximity to one another, or with the same group of learners, or within the same formally joined up structure of provision, did not know that much about what their counterparts were doing. Meanwhile, competition for funding and different views on the importance of particular approaches to language learning was creating what some participants described as turf wars and a lack of innovation or creativity or willingness to explore doing things differently, not so much in terms of ESOL provision itself, but in terms of working together and joining up the dots. And I'll pass back over to Francesca now to speak a bit more about the Glasgow context.
So Glasgow is very distinctive and perhaps unique in Scotland in terms of its ESOL landscape. As Scotland's largest city, Glasgow has a particularly complex and varied ESOL landscape that reflects patterns of migration to the city, and particularly the fact that it is the only local authority in Scotland to take in asylum seekers through the UK government's dispersal scheme. In Glasgow too, the profile of learners has changed quite dramatically over the last 20 years. So the arrival of asylum seekers through the UK dispersal scheme beginning in around 2000 was a key driver behind the growth of ESOL provision in Glasgow, and indeed a key driver behind the creation of the first 2007 Scotland ESOL strategy. In the early 2000s, up to 80% of ESOL learners in Glasgow were asylum seekers. This proportion decreased in the mid-2000s with the arrival of large number of EU and particularly EU migrant workers, particularly from Central and East European states. However, this trend has again been reversed in the last few years, and according to our expert interviewees, the vast majority of ESOL learners, again around 80%, are asylum seekers or refugees who have settled in the greater Glasgow area. There are smaller pockets of ESOL learners among migrant workers, particularly from Central and Eastern Europe, from countries such as Poland and Slovakia, as well as from some Southern European states or some Southern American states. There is also some demand from local settled communities, particularly Pakistani and Chinese. Glasgow also has a very diverse range of ESOL classes delivered by different providers. So the three further education colleges are by far the biggest providers and offer accredited classes across various campus locations for a minimum of 14 hours a week based on a national curriculum. Then there is Glasgow Life, the organization leading the local CLD partnership that offers non-accredited classes in the community, mostly at lower levels and for a few hours a week. And there is a wide range of third sector organizations that also offer ESOL classes. And these organizations range from those with a long sort of established history of offering ESOL classes, such as Glasgow ESOL Forum and AWA, to integration networks based in different parts of the city, to local development trusts and faith groups. Most third sector organizations offer non-accredited classes in the community, and most of these are at lower levels. But some providers have started or are looking into providing accredited classes, and there is also much more variation in terms of how ESOL is taught. So some classes are level, some are not. Some are taught by qualified and very experienced staff. Some are taught by a mix of volunteers and paid staff, and so on. And the approach in the voluntary sector tends to be more the kind of social practice approach that Becca has described. So the ESOL funding landscape is also very diverse in Glasgow. So like everywhere elsewhere in Scotland, SFC funding was routed to community planning partnerships, and in Glasgow, this partnership includes the three colleges as well as Glasgow Life, Glasgow ESOL Forum and WEA. When changes to the funding models were made in 2018, these were interpreted differently in Glasgow compared to Aberdeenshire. So the different partners, as we understand it, got money in pretty much the same way as before through survey level agreements, and also funding for non-college partners is not outcome-based and tied to attendance or progression. But a lot of community ESOL provision in Glasgow is not funded by SFC, but by a range of other sources, such as City Council Community Fund, separate strands of Scottish government funds, some ad hoc grant funding, and contracts with other organisations such as the Scottish Refugee Council. One interviewee from the third sector told us, we get 30% of our annual income from the Scottish government, and then we have to raise the other 70% through grants and other contracts. So the landscape of ESOL provision and challenges are very different in Glasgow and Aberdeenshire, and this is partly a matter of scale, as demand and provision is more concentrated in urban areas compared to rural ones. It is also fair to say that the challenges in Glasgow are perhaps more similar to those of other dispersal cities elsewhere in the UK than to other local authorities in Scotland. A persistent challenge for Glasgow has been around numbers as demand outstrips supply. And looking at the number of people who have applied for a place in an ESOL class through the Glasgow ESOL register, WEA estimated that at the beginning of 2021, there were around 10,000 people waiting for an ESOL class, and they had basically gone through the list to exclude the duplicates. And around 4,000 of them had been tested for the level of English already. So this translates in very long waiting lists, particularly for college places, and this is a long-standing issue, but it is likely that to have been exacerbated by the pandemic, where some classes were suspended, and also ESOL assessment sessions to test people were suspended. Demand is high both for college places and for community classes, but it is especially acute for lower level classes, which tend to be community-based classes. Demand for college places has not diminished, and indeed college classes are popular among some ESOL learners who see them as better than community provision, but research has also shown that college classes and pressures around attendance and progression are not suitable for all learners. Although colleges are now offering some literacy classes and perhaps more beginner level classes, it is largely the voluntary sector that has tried to step in to meet demand at lower levels, often relying on short-term and ad hoc funding. And this is one of the quotes, in the slide refers to. So there's stuff popping up all over the place. Another challenge for the past several years has been around the coordination of access, testing and progression for ESOL learners in the Glasgow area. A 2015 report commissioned, as we understand it, by the Glasgow ESOL Partnership recommended setting up a single ESOL waiting list for Glasgow. And in response to this, a Glasgow ESOL register was set up in 2016. So anyone wishing to register for a community or college class had to register their interest online. They are then invited to a free ESOL assessment session and receive a certificate which shows their level of English. And then all providers are supposed to draw on the centralized register to recruit students. However, this has not worked well, and the ESOL register project has been suspended basically through lack of funding recently, although some parts of this project have continued. So the key issues that have been highlighted to us are that not all providers have been consistently loyal to the register, so some have recruited their own students, and this has resulted in very significant discrepancies in terms of how long people wait for an ESOL class. Some colleges also say that testing is not always conducted appropriately, and so they sometimes have to retest prospective students before allocating them to classes. Some of the interviewees reckon that part of the reason why the registers has been ineffective for a number of years is that it is under-resourced, although there are also complex politics behind the coordination and provision of classes. And other aspects of coordination have worked better. So there's a lot of, again, of like creativity in terms of like partnerships across different ESOL providers. And also colleges have agreed a community graduate scheme with certain community providers who can make recommendations about which students who have been doing ESOL with them are ready and willing to take up a college place. So a point worth emphasizing is the importance of coordination of provision and long-term investments, and this is widely recognized by different providers in Glasgow. And in early 2021, The major Esol providers in Glasgow put together a business case for increased investment for Esol in Glasgow that identified key gaps in provision and coordination. So the main challenges that Glasgow faces in terms of unmet demand and coordination are similar to those described in other UK dispersal cities, where a fragmented or patchwork provision is a result of insufficient funding and a lack of long-term vision. And interestingly, in many of these cities, there seems to be a renewed interest in creating Esol hubs to coordinate provision and distribute information, and sometimes also sharing waiting lists. So I'm just going to pass over to Becca for some reflections on the challenges around COVID.
Thanks, Francesca. So as Francesca's pointed out there were quite some significant differences in the challenges experienced in Aberdeenshire and Glasgow more broadly. But certainly the COVID pandemic, with its lockdowns, social distancing rules, and switch to online learning, presented challenges to everybody we spoke to and to all kinds of ESOL providers and initiatives. And we were incredibly impressed by the speed with which organisations, but also individual tutors, volunteers and learners had been able to respond. We learned from a number of participants that a move towards blended learning had already been on the agenda, both in Glasgow and across Aberdeenshire prior to the pandemic, perhaps especially so in rural areas. This meant that some providers already had digital learning platforms and an element of staff training in place. Nonetheless, everyone talked about what a massive undertaking it had been to turn things around and get provision online within a matter of weeks. Many were surprised by how quickly they'd managed this, and all had helped to support learners to access technology and to help them get online where possible. Nonetheless, there were many concerns about who had been left out. Digital inequalities were raised as a big issue, especially for those working with asylum seeker and refugee learners, some of whom were destitute or had been moved to hotel accommodation with very poor access to technology and internet connectivity. Problems with connectivity, low-speed connections, and black spots were also a big issue in some rural locations. Beyond this, many people spoke about the difficulties for beginners and learners with very low-level English language skills. And you can see a quote about this from Expert 8 on the slide. Older learners and volunteers were also thought to find it harder to deal with the technologies involved, and almost everyone said that they'd just lost not only some groups of learners, but also some volunteers. On the other hand, participants did identify advantages, perhaps especially in more geographically remote areas. People pointed out that online classes could be easier to access for learners with inconvenient or changing work schedules, that learners with children could attend even if they were unable to arrange childcare, that in rural places and where transport links were poor, participants could find it easier to attend online. During the most severe lockdowns, when social isolation was very acute, in both rural locations and bigger cities like Glasgow and Aberdeen, online classes and language cafes were described as a bit of a lifeline, a point of connection, and something people attended not only to improve their language, but also just to see other people and maintain a sense of social connection. In Aberdeenshire, there was quite a lot of pooling of provision, with learners from Aberdeen City, Peterhead, Fraserburgh, and other smaller locations all coming together in online language cafes, for example. This actually seemed like something which might be useful in the longer term, especially for more rural areas where there is demand, but often spread out across quite a wide geographical area. And opportunities to bring language learners together online can help to keep classes viable, not only financially, but in terms of enough people turning up each week. Also, learners in one of the language cafes I attended online for several months talked about enjoying the diversity of learners when different locations came together. So for the first time, East Europeans from Peterhead and Fraserburgh were in the same cafes and classes as Latin Americans, Syrians, Hong Kong Chinese from Aberdeen and other areas of the Shire. There were mixed opinions about what the future would hold, though. While some providers and learners were sure that blended learning at least is here to stay, others were dying to get back to face-to-face classes. And there was a feeling amongst many that this is still the best and most inclusive option. This was particularly pertinent where people were concerned about the wider function of ESOL classes in terms of ensuring students' well-being, challenging and preventing social isolation, and supporting mental health. To conclude then, we don't want to pretend that we have the answers or even that there are any easy or straightforward answers. However, we thought it would be good to summarise some key themes which we see emerging from the study at what is still quite an early stage in our analysis, and to ask you for your thoughts and ideas around them. There seems to be quite a lot of consensus on the need for an overarching strategy that's fit for purpose and joined up with other relevant policy areas such as migration policy, policies around integration and community development, as well as educational policies. This more joined up view is there to an extent in things like the new Scots strategy for asylum seekers and refugees, but is much less clearly articulated, for example, in the Scottish Government's thinking about how to attract and retain migrant workers and their families. Given ongoing discussion about what exactly will replace the current Esol strategy, which has already expired, we wonder what spaces you see for Esol practitioners and perhaps even learners to input into these policy level conversations. And also what kinds of leadership and strategic thinking you feel is most needed and at which levels, local authority, Scotland, UK-wide even. This raises questions of whether now is in fact a good time to push for a more joined up approach that would be better able to coordinate diverse kinds of provision and encourage cooperation and innovation both across Scotland's many geographical contexts, but also between diverse providers and between those working with diverse groups of learners within one context. We wonder whether a way to envision this is through an infrastructure and framework that starts from the needs of learners, rather than drawing boundaries around what is or is not Esol. So beginning from understanding an Esol learner's language needs in the context of their wider lives, something which we constantly found teachers and practitioners doing on an instinctive level and reflecting on in their practice, but often in quite a standalone way. We'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on if and how this might be done more systematically, and what kinds of partnerships and collaborations would be helpful here. Finally, there seems to be a need to reflect on and think through the best ways to harness the creativity and innovation which responses to the pandemic produced, but also to do this in a way which is sensitive to the downsides and to what could be all too easily lost. Since our fieldwork ended in the middle of the year, when the country was still largely in some degree of lockdown, we'd be really interested to hear about your experiences since the summer and your thoughts and expectations about the future of online, blended and face-to-face learning, as well as other creative initiatives. How can we preserve the best of new practices, but also make space to go back to things that were good before, and or make sure that we deal with inequalities in relation to access and resource for online activities? And we'll leave it there in terms of our input, and hopefully there's still time for a good discussion now before going on to the next session.